You're standing in a field thousands of years ago. No bathroom, no toilet paper, no plumbing, no sewage system. And then your stomach tells you you need to go. So you walk away from the camp, find a quiet spot, and handle the problem the same way humans had been handling it for thousands of generations. But eventually, that stopped working, because humans stopped moving. They began building permanent settlements. They started storing food, raising animals, digging wells, building houses closer together. And eventually, they created something that completely changed the problem: cities. Because once hundreds or thousands of people start living in the same place, human waste becomes more than an unpleasant smell. It becomes an engineering problem. Where does it go? And more importantly, how do you stop it from getting into the water you're about to drink? That question is basically the beginning of sanitation. And surprisingly, the history of the toilet goes back thousands of years before the modern flush toilet ever existed. In fact, some of the earliest known toilets are older than several famous civilizations people usually associate with ancient history. So let's go back to the beginning. Long before toilets, humans had a much simpler solution. Don't live in one place. Hunter-gatherer groups moved around regularly. If someone used the bathroom somewhere outside the camp, there was usually no long-term accumulation. Nature handled most of it. But permanent settlements changed everything. One of the earliest examples comes from the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. People were living there more than 9,000 years ago. The settlement contained hundreds of buildings packed relatively close together. And archaeologists have found evidence of human waste inside and around these houses, which makes sense. If you have hundreds of people living in one settlement for generations, eventually you're going to have a sanitation problem. And unfortunately, ancient humans did not have a municipal waste department, so they had to improvise. Some of the earliest known purpose-built toilets appear thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East. At places such as Tel Aswad and other early settlements, archaeologists have found evidence suggesting people were already deliberately managing human waste. But then something much more impressive happened. Around 4,500 years ago, people living in the Indus Valley Civilization were building cities with surprisingly sophisticated sanitation systems. This is where the story gets interesting. Cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa contained houses with bathing areas, drains, wells, and toilets. And these weren't isolated luxury features. Drainage systems were built into the architecture of the city itself. Some houses had private bathrooms. Some had structures that appear to have functioned as toilets. Waste could be directed into drains or collection systems outside the living area, and the streets themselves contained carefully constructed drainage channels. Think about how strange that is. You're living almost 5,000 years ago. No electricity, no modern microbiology, no germ theory, no modern sewage treatment. And yet somebody is looking at a pile of human waste and thinking, that needs a drainage system. Honestly, that's a pretty good start. The Indus Valley Civilization is particularly interesting because sanitation appears to have been integrated into urban planning. Water management wasn't just something added later, it was part of the city. Wells were common, bathrooms existed, drains connected different parts of settlements. And some waste systems were designed so that solid material could be collected while liquids were carried away. We don't know exactly how every toilet was used. Archaeology rarely gives us a convenient instruction manual titled, "Congratulations, you have discovered the ancient toilet. Step 1, Hielinim Pades." But the physical evidence tells us something important. People were deliberately separating human waste from living spaces. And that idea would appear repeatedly throughout human history. Thousands of kilometers away, ancient Egypt developed its own sanitation practices. Egyptian houses sometimes contained simple toilet seats or toilet structures. These were not flush toilets in the modern sense. Instead, waste could fall into containers or pits beneath the seat. Some wealthy households had more sophisticated arrangements, but sanitation in ancient Egypt was not universally available. Like almost everything else in ancient history, your experience depended heavily on where you sat in the social hierarchy. Literally, the wealthy could afford private facilities. Ordinary people often relied on simpler methods. And then we arrive in ancient Mesopotamia. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers produced some of the world's earliest cities, and with cities came one enormous problem: waste. Archaeologists have found toilets and drainage systems in ancient Mesopotamian settlements. Some toilets used simple vertical shafts. Others directed waste into drains or pits. The basic principle was remarkably consistent: separate the human from the waste. It's not exactly glamorous architecture, but it works. Then the Romans came along and took sanitation to another level. Ancient Rome is famous for roads, aqueducts, concrete, military engineering, and enormous buildings. But Rome also had a serious relationship with sewage. The Romans constructed large sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima. It began as a drainage channel and was eventually incorporated into a much larger sewer network. Its purpose wasn't simply to deal with toilets. It also helped drain parts of the city, and that distinction matters. Ancient sewers were not always designed around the modern concept of flushing every toilet directly into a treatment plant. They were often designed primarily for drainage, but Roman public toilets were still a major part of urban life. And these were not exactly private experiences. Public latrines could contain rows of stone seats positioned next to each other. No partitions, no doors, just a row of people sitting next to each other and conducting their business. Privacy? Apparently optional. And here's something even stranger. Roman toilets were often social spaces. People could talk, discuss business, exchange gossip, conduct political conversations. Basically the ancient Roman equivalent of sitting in a bathroom with your friends, except there were no stalls. And probably significantly less scrolling. Underneath these seats, wastewater could flow through channels. Some facilities used running water to carry away waste. The water might come from the city's water supply, but here's where modern assumptions can get us into trouble. Romans did not understand germs. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know that microscopic organisms could cause disease. So although their sanitation systems were impressive, their understanding of why sanitation mattered was completely different from ours. They were solving practical problems: bad smells, waste accumulation, drainage, water management, urban cleanliness. The germ theory of disease would come much, much later. And this is one of the most important points in the entire history of sanitation. Humans were managing waste long before they understood disease transmission. You don't need to know what bacteria are to realize that drinking water from a ditch full of sewage is probably a bad idea. You just need to survive long enough to notice the pattern. And humans did. But toilets weren't always connected to enormous sewer systems. One of the most important technologies in toilet history was much simpler: the pit toilet. Dig a hole, put a structure over it, use it. Eventually cover it or empty it. Not exactly revolutionary, but incredibly effective. Versions of this basic design appeared across many societies, and the principle is still used today in parts of the world. Another important development was the use of cesspits. Instead of allowing waste to spread around the settlement, people could collect it in underground pits. This created a controlled location for waste. The downside? Eventually someone had to clean it, and that job was usually about as pleasant as you would expect. In medieval Europe, sanitation became much more complicated. Cities grew, populations increased, and sewage management often failed to keep up. People used chamber pots. Waste could be dumped into cesspits. Some buildings had latrines built over streams, drains, or pits. In castles, you sometimes find structures known as garderobes. Despite the fancy name, the basic concept was simple. A toilet was positioned over a vertical shaft. Waste dropped downward. Some garderobes emptied outside the building. Others connected to drainage channels. And yes, some castles basically had toilets built into their walls. The engineering wasn't always terrible. The smell probably was. In crowded medieval cities, human and animal waste could accumulate in streets and open drains. But again, we have to be careful not to imagine that everyone simply threw everything everywhere all the time. Different cities had different rules. Some authorities attempted to regulate waste disposal. People dug cesspits. Some households had private latrines. There were also professionals whose job involved removing accumulated waste. The problem was that sanitation infrastructure often couldn't keep up with population density. And then something happened that changed our understanding of the entire subject: disease outbreaks. For centuries, people had competing explanations for disease: bad air, miasma, poison, imbalance of bodily fluids, supernatural causes, and many other theories. The idea that invisible microorganisms could spread disease wasn't widely accepted until much later. Then came the 19th century. Cities were becoming enormous. London, Paris, New York, and other industrial cities were expanding rapidly, and sewage was becoming a massive urban problem. London provides one of the most important examples. During the 19th century, the city struggled with contaminated water, overflowing cesspits, sewage, and horrific smells. One event became particularly famous: the Great Stink of 1858. The River Thames had become heavily polluted with sewage. The smell became so severe that it reportedly interfered with life and government in central London. Curtains were soaked with chemicals in attempts to reduce the smell. People complained, politicians complained, everyone complained, and eventually the government acted. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed an enormous sewer network for London. Thousands of workers constructed miles of underground infrastructure. The system redirected sewage away from the central city and toward treatment and discharge points farther downstream. This was not the modern sewage treatment system we know today, but it represented a huge change. Sanitation was becoming a matter of large-scale civil engineering, and this is where the modern toilet begins to make much more sense, because a toilet by itself doesn't solve the sanitation problem. You need somewhere for the waste to go. You need water. You need pipes. You need drainage. You need sewage infrastructure. And eventually, you need treatment. Without those systems, flushing a toilet simply moves the problem somewhere else. Which brings us to one of the most famous inventions in toilet history, the flush toilet. Contrary to popular belief, the basic concept is not modern. One early example comes from the Palace of Knossos on Crete, where archaeological evidence suggests a water-flushing toilet may have existed more than 3,000 years ago. The technology was primitive compared with modern plumbing. But the basic idea was already there. Use water to move waste away. Thousands of years later, similar concepts would reappear in more advanced forms. In 16th century England, Sir John Harington designed a flushing toilet for Queen Elizabeth I. His design used a water tank and valve mechanism. It worked, but it didn't immediately transform society. Why? Because a toilet is only as useful as the infrastructure supporting it. You can build the world's greatest flushing toilet, but if your house doesn't have running water or sewage pipes, congratulations, you have invented an extremely complicated bucket. The next major developments came during the 18th and 19th centuries. Improvements in valves, water supplies, ceramic manufacturing, plumbing, and sewer systems made flush toilets increasingly practical. In the 19th century, inventors such as Alexander Cumming and Thomas Crapper became associated with developments in toilet technology. And here's another historical misconception. Thomas Crapper did not invent the toilet. He was an important plumber and businessman who improved and popularized certain toilet technologies. And the word crap does not come from his name. The word is much older. So unfortunately, history does not give us that satisfying coincidence. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, flush toilets were becoming increasingly common in wealthy urban areas. But the biggest revolution wasn't actually the toilet itself. It was the entire sanitation system surrounding it. Clean water, sewers, wastewater treatment, building regulations, public health departments, regular waste collection, and eventually a scientific understanding of pathogens. Once scientists established that microorganisms could cause disease and contaminate water, sanitation stopped being merely about smell and cleanliness. It became a public health technology. That changed everything. Water treatment became increasingly important. Sewage treatment became more sophisticated. Cities began separating drinking water systems from wastewater systems, and governments started regulating plumbing and sanitation. The modern bathroom is basically the result of thousands of years of separate inventions finally being connected into one system. A toilet sends waste into a pipe. The pipe connects to a sewer. The sewer transports it. Treatment facilities remove solids and contaminants. Water is processed. And only then does the cycle continue. The entire thing works so smoothly that most people never think about it, which is probably the greatest compliment sanitation engineering can receive, because when sanitation works, you don't notice it. You turn a handle, water disappears, and the problem is gone. But that apparently simple action represents thousands of years of experimentation. Ancient pits, stone drains, cesspits, Roman sewers, medieval latrines, early flushing systems, industrial plumbing, modern wastewater treatment, and scientific discoveries about disease. The history of the toilet isn't really the history of one invention. It's the history of humans repeatedly solving the same basic problem with increasingly sophisticated technology. How do you separate waste from people? At first, the answer was simple: walk away. Then it became dig a hole, then build a pit, then construct a drain, then build a sewer, then move sewage outside the city, then treat the wastewater, and eventually build a system where the entire process happens almost invisibly. Today, billions of people use toilets without thinking about the engineering underneath them. But that convenience is not evenly distributed. Even now, hundreds of millions of people around the world still lack access to safely managed sanitation. That means the basic problem humans were trying to solve thousands of years ago isn't completely solved. The technology exists. The challenge is infrastructure, cost, geography, governance, and access. So the next time you sit on a modern toilet, you're not just sitting on a piece of porcelain. You're sitting at the end of a technological chain that stretches back thousands of years, a chain that includes ancient cities, Roman engineers, medieval cesspits, 19th century sewer builders, microbiologists, plumbers, and a frankly ridiculous amount of human waste. And the funniest part, the toilet is one of the most important technologies in human history precisely because nobody wants to think about it. No one wakes up and says, "Wow, I really appreciate the incredible wastewater infrastructure beneath my feet." They just flush. And that's the point. The best sanitation system is the one you never have to notice. From digging holes in the ground, to building underground sewer networks, to treating billions of liters of wastewater, the basic problem never changed. Humans eat, humans digest, humans produce waste. The only thing that changed was what we decided to do with it. And apparently, after thousands of years of experimentation, we finally figured out that putting it in the drinking water was a bad idea, which, honestly, was probably one of humanity's more important discoveries. This is Toko Explains, and that's the surprisingly long history of the toilet.